Pokemon's 6th generation marked a turning point for the series. One of the key components of Generation 6 was accessibility to a much wider audience. Naturally, this brought several changes to the series, most of which still exist in today's Pokemon games and many of which fans are not very fond of. In this video, I'll be talking about two pairs of games which made up Gen 6. Pokemon X and Y, and Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Not only do I think that these titles are underrated, I believe that they, at times, represent Pokemon at some of its greatest heights. While by no means perfect, these games did so much right that often gets overlooked. I'll be going over the world, story, features, controversies, and more in regards to both of these Pokemon titles. Pokemon X and Y, and with it Generation 6 as a whole, is going to be a decade old later this year, which is actually crazy. Looking back, Generation 6 was so much more impactful than the franchise than people realize, for better and for worse. Anyways, thank you for watching, and with that, let's talk about Generation 6. On October 12th, 2013, for the first time ever, the entire world got to experience the new generation of Pokemon on the exact same date. The worldwide release of Pokemon X and Y kicked off the 6th generation in a brand new region known as Kalos. Based on real-world France, Kalos made full use of the Pokemon series' new fully 3D graphics, with dozens of iconic landmarks, a variety of geographical sites, and charming towns and cities accompanying the player throughout the entire game. As with all Pokemon regions, Kalos was heavily influenced by real-life features, with there being no better example of this than Lumiose City. Being the Star City of Kalos, Lumiose City and the Prism Tower are the region's defining traits, with obvious basis on Paris and its Eiffel Tower. Lumiose itself has a slightly similar layout to Castelia City of the prior generation. Castelia incorporated 3D scrolling effects to create the city's distinctly circular shape. Lumiose also applies a similar idea, and while the entire game is in 3D, the outer ring of Lumiose is really 3D somehow. I remember when I first played Pokemon Y back in 2013, I was absolutely disoriented by how enormous the city felt. Upon replaying, I expected to feel differently about this, but honestly to this day, Lumiose is still the city that feels the largest in all of Pokemon. Maybe it's due to the perspective that the game uses, which makes the buildings feel a lot taller. Either way though, Lumiose is awesome and was a defining part of establishing Pokemon's brand new 3D style, even if it does seem to have a bit of an energy crisis for the entire game. But Lumiose is by no means the only or even the most interesting location in the Kalos region. So let's rewind to the very beginning of the adventure, in Vanillave Town. All in all, Vanillave is pretty much your standard Pokemon starting town, but throughout every single mainline Pokemon game that I've played, that being every game except Scarlet and Violet, X and Y by far has the least focus on your hometown. Literally all you do is wake up, get your standard equipment from your mom, walk down the comically short Route 1, and you're in the far more important Aqua town. Overall though, it's a solid Pokemon hometown design-wise. Definitely more creative than the classic 2x2 housing arrangement we saw in so many of the older titles. Immediately upon exiting your house, you are greeted by two strangers. One is Shauna, who becomes your fun-loving, more upbeat, less serious rival throughout the game. And the other is either Serena or Calum as your main, more serious rival. I played the game as Calum, so if I accidentally refer to the rival as Serena, obviously it could be either or. After this introduction and the following 3-second walk down Route 1, we're greeted with even more strangers upon entering Aqua. Tierno and Trevor are two characters which take on a yet unseen role when it comes to Pokemon rivals. They really don't battle you very often throughout the course of the game, and when they do, they're notoriously easy to beat. But the game makes it very clear that they're not just bad Pokemon trainers, rather that battling just isn't what they're focusing on in their adventures. Trevor is obsessed with completing the Pokédex, and Tierno just likes to dance and do other random activities with his Pokemon, such as martial arts. This is where we get to the first of several controversies that came along with this game, the Friends. This group of 4 will accompany you throughout the entirety of the game's main story until Victory Road, and wow, are these guys hated. Like, seriously, I don't know if I've seen this much hate for any Pokemon character except maybe Hop. The main complaint seems to be that their personalities are dull and that their battles are too easy, which, sure. When it comes to really compelling personalities in Pokemon, they're not the best. But other characters that have come before them are just as dull and don't get near the same level of hate. At least they have motivations besides the standard I want to be the best trainer. Except Shauna, actually. She doesn't really have any special interests like Trev and Tierno, and she openly admits that she isn't committed to becoming a strong battler like the player and their rival. And this lack of commitment toward a goal isn't really a bad thing character development wise, but it's the fact that this never really gets resolved in the game's story that makes it disappointing. And disappointing is pretty much Pokemon X and Y's middle name. It's pretty widely known at this point that X and Y were supposed to be a lot more than they ended up being, in the narrative department especially. I think that Shauna is just another unfortunate instance of that. And yeah, the three that aren't Serena are all easy battles basically anytime. While it would have been crazy to have 4 whole rivals who get the same level of difficulty as the traditional main rival in Pokemon games, as someone who almost exclusively plays Pokemon with Nuzlocke rules these days, preparing for a battle with one of them around every corner would be a grind, to say the absolute least. And if you're complaining about Pokemon game difficulty levels, you're probably a Nuzlocker anyway. It is kind of hilarious though how in Tierno's final battle he has a level 49 Roserade that only knows the move Petal Dance. So anyways, you meet them at a table in the town square, get introduced to everyone, give yourself a nickname, and then Serena reveals the 3 starter Pokemon entrusted to her by Professor Sycamore. Chespin, Finnegan, and Froakie are Kalos' options, and in terms of starter Pokemon, this is a pretty solid lineup. Definitely not Hoenn levels of greatness, but it stands within the upper echelon of Pokemon starters by region. After a refreshingly brief tutorial segment including a charming and kind of hilarious walk through Santaloon Forest, you reach the first city of the game and home of the first gym battle, Santaloon City. This is where you are introduced to a brand new form of transportation, the roller skates. Upon being given these skates, they will be on your feet for the rest of the game. They allow for much quicker movement speed than regular running, but take a second to accelerate and are incapable of precise navigation. I'm really not sure how I feel about them, to be honest. On one hand, it's absolutely a defining feature of Pokemon X and Y. When given wide open spaces, speeding along with them is quite fun, especially in Lumiose. But they're permanently bound to the circle pad, and if you're someone like me who had become used to being able to use the standard 8-directional movement with the circle pad, you're just out of luck. This forced me to use the D-pad for much of the game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but its positioning on a 3DS makes holding it kind of awkward after a while. However, there's a bit of an exploit I discovered while replaying for this video, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one who has used this method. A bit later in the game, just before the second gym, an NPC will stop you and give you a dowsing machine. On top of being just a great thing to use anyways because of the valuable items you can find, it also allows you to move without the roller skates while using the circle pad. Because of this, I found myself holding the dowsing machine for almost my entire playthrough, and as a bonus I found more rare candies by the end of the game than I have in any other game before. Although it is still kinda weird that this feature, while still being cool to have, is unable to be turned off if you don't want to use it. I really hope something like that never happens again in a Pokemon game. Oh, that's right. It does. So, I talked about the first 10 minutes of the game pretty in depth, but here's where I'm going to zoom out a bit and start to focus more on the gameplay and new features which X and Y introduced. And what better place to start than with the single most controversial change that Pokemon has ever made, the new EXP Share in X and Y. These games introduced a brand new way to level up your team through the revamped EXP Share, and this pretty much changed everything. To this day, the fanbase remains divided over this one feature that would end up not only a mainstay for future titles, but for the last 2 generations of Pokemon it has become mandatory. I'm sure you're already aware of what it does. Normally, the EXP Share in older Pokemon games was much less of a big deal. You had to find it usually by talking to a random NPC in each game. Similarly, its ability was much less impactful. It would only distribute extra experience to the Pokemon which held it in your party. The main purpose of it was to allow for a quicker way to catch a weak Pokemon up to the rest of your party, without having used the classic send it out and then immediately switch it method. But in X and Y, instead of requiring it to be held by one Pokemon, it now sits as a key item in your bag. And so long as it's turned on, it'll distribute extra XP to every Pokemon in your party. The intent of this was to open Pokemon games to a much wider audience, namely working adults who simply don't have the time required to grind an entire team into leveling up individually. And guess what? There's nothing wrong with that. I generally avoid using the EXP Share whenever I Nuzlocke generations 6 and 7, simply because I believe it's in the spirit of the challenge to dedicate time to every single Pokemon on your team. But when I just did a normal playthrough of Pokemon X and Y for the purpose of making this video, with the EXP Share enabled, I genuinely appreciated the pace at which the game flowed. And no, it didn't make the game a cakewalk either. Had I been nuzlocking, I still would have lost several good Pokemon throughout the playthrough. Granted, I was playing far less carefully because I knew my Pokemon's deaths weren't permanent, but I still tried to keep my team alive regardless. All of this is to say that this new EXP Share isn't objectively a bad idea. The important part is you can disable it if you so choose, making it a convenient feature rather than an intrusion to the player's preferences, as it would later become in Generation 8 onward where you absolutely cannot turn it off. X and Y so often online gets the blame for even initiating the idea of a party-wide EXP share, but it wasn't until 6 years later where it would become a real problem. The real issue with the EXP share isn't an issue of convenience but an issue of challenge. In the eyes of many hardcore fans, the EXP share automatically makes any Pokemon game which it is used in easy, but this just isn't true. Pokemon Sun and Moon, especially the Ultra remakes, are in the opinions of many fans, including myself, some of the most challenging Pokemon games ever. And if you don't think it's hard enough, as I said before, you can always just turn the EXP share off. So what about X and Y's difficulty? It's a bit complicated. Do I think that X and Y are easy Pokemon games? Yes. If Platinum and Black 2 and White 2 are up here, then X and Y is like down here somewhere. But why exactly is it so much easier? EXP share aside, I feel like one of the main issues which is hindering the difficulty of modern Pokemon games is one I don't see many talk about. Today's Pokemon games just give you so many options. Generation 5 was so effective in its challenge because it forced you to work with Pokemon that were brand new. It limited your options route by route, making sure that the right Pokemon for an eventual obstacle were available without literally handing them to you like X and Y does. In Kalos, not only can you find things like Hoenn before the second gym, a Ghost Steel type, literally the two most overpowered early game types, but you're also just given another starter Pokemon, the other being one of the Kanto starters from Professor Sycamore, all of which can Mega Evolve. On top of that, you're just handed a level 32 Lucario at the third gym. In earlier Pokemon games, that would have been an egg, from which a level 1 Riolu would hatch, making you put in the effort required if you wanted to use that really good Lucario eventually. I get all of these things speed up the gameplay pace and allow for a quicker completion of the game, but since when were RPGs played to be finished quickly? It's always been in the nature of a turn-based RPG like Pokemon to make the player grind, to force them to put in time in order to overcome an obstacle. Pokemon has lost that, and despite how much I'll defend X and Y, it was the point that the series turned down this path. At this point, you may have noticed that I've been neglecting to mention one slight detail about Pokemon X and Y. It's nothing major, and I'm sure many have even forgotten about it themselves. But I wouldn't be able to talk about Generation 6 without mentioning something called Mega Evolution. Mega Evolution as a concept alone is one of the coolest ideas Pokemon has had maybe ever. The idea of these fully evolved Pokemon, even some legendaries, being able to go temporarily one step further and become even more powerful opens the door to so many possibilities. Before I even mention how it affects gameplay, what it did for the narratives of the games it appeared in was awesome. While Diantha will never go down as the most difficult of Pokemon champions, facing off against her Mega Gardevoir with a Mega of your own is aesthetically something on a completely different level than anything we'd seen before. Mega Evolution isn't just a power boost though, it affects the behavior and the mental state of the Pokemon affected by it. According to some Pokédex entries, Mega Evolution, if achieved without a sufficiently strong bond with the trainer, causes the Pokemon to enter a pained state, sending them into a potentially deadly rage. That's super grim for a Pokemon game, but it showed that Game Freak actually cared about Mega Evolution in more than a mechanical sense, but in a way that gave it actual substance and consequence in the Pokemon world. But unfortunately, what's awesome in a story sense doesn't always perfectly translate over to gameplay. And while I think that Mega Evolution can be great, it all comes down to limiting its usage. In X and Y, you are given the Mega Ring, a Lucario which can Mega Evolve, and Lucario's Mega Stone all at once after beating the third gym. From that point forward, during any battle, you can activate your Mega Ring and have a basically unkillable, strong and fast sweeper for 5 turns, more than enough to end a battle. It basically trivializes 90% of the game from that point forward, and it's all made worse by the fact that there are only 3 other trainers which can use Mega Evolution: Diantha, Lysander, and your rival. And I noticed that during those fights specifically, my opinion of Mega Evolution as a mechanic improved drastically. It's just not fun if your opponent isn't using it too. This is why, despite how much of a fan favorite it is, or how aesthetically awesome it is, I can't really say that I want Mega Evolution to return in a future game. Sword and Shield's Dynamaxing is the closest we've come to Mega Evolution since Gen 6, and despite how boring it is to look at, it fixes the issue of overusing it in the perfect way. Dynamax can only be activated in certain areas known as power spots. Naturally, these power spots are perfect places to build gyms, so Dynamaxing is limited to gym battles, the Pokemon League, and various Pokemon dens scattered throughout the region. If you're not in one of those places, it's normal Pokemon battling. This is such a smart way to implement a mechanic like this, and it doesn't allow the player to breeze through the regular trainers and rival battles because they have a literal super weapon and their opponent doesn't. We were all under the impression at the time that Mega Evolution was going to be the new normal for Pokemon games, but obviously it was ushered out just as quickly as Generation 7 came along. Game Freak does get a lot of criticism for introducing a new meta-changing battle mechanic every generation, but I gotta say that I honestly kinda like that approach. Not everyone is going to like a big new feature like that, just as there were many who didn't like Mega Evolution, so having it as a one and done part of the generation in which it was introduced is a good way to keep things fresh while not alienating a massive part of the Pokemon fanbase. All of this is to say that while Mega Evolution was awesome, I think it's for the best that it's come and gone and likely will not return. It's often said that a story is only as good as its villain. So how good is the story if the villains are these people? I'll go ahead and spoil it for you. It's not the best, but there is one bright diamond in the rough of all this story that I will get to, and if you're familiar with this game, you probably already know who that is. But anyways, before all that, Team Flare, Kalos' signature gang of evildoers, led by the part-time cafe owner, full-time insane sociopath Lysander. In terms of evil team leaders, he's not the worst, even though I actually can't think of anyone less appealing as a villain than him. So maybe he is the worst. But he can't be that bad if I had to think about it. He seems to sort of ride the coattails of Ghetsis from the generation prior in a way. Like Ghetsis, he cultivates a relatively sizable following of civilian supporters, not through threats or fear tactics, but simply because they think he makes a good point somehow. Even your rival at a point late in the game says something along the lines of, you know, he makes a good point, but he's just too crazy about it. Like, no, he doesn't. His logic is so bizarre that I'm honestly concerned for Serena and or Calum for even trying to agree with him. But what exactly are his and Team Flare's goals? Well, for one, he's obsessed with beauty. He thinks that everything must be beautiful, and if it isn't, it should not exist. He doesn't really display much desire for power or control, although his admins do. He believes that the world in its current state is beautiful, and in order to ensure that it remains that way, he must kill all Pokemon and anyone who is not a member of Team Flare. Seriously, that's his plan. I don't really understand it myself. He tries to argue that the existence of Pokemon leads to conflict, which makes the world an uglier place. But unlike Ghetsis, he doesn't even try to act like he cares about Pokemon themselves. He just sees them as tools which are used improperly by humans. So how exactly does he want to accomplish this eradication of basically 99% of life on Earth? By using the ultimate weapon. Underneath Geosenge Town, there's a massive Team Flare base, and directly underneath the town's signature rock formation there is something of a missile silo, containing a massive super weapon. This weapon wasn't created by Team Flare, and has existed at least 3,000 years before the events of X and Y's story. The device seems to possess near unlimited power, and can be used to end all life on the planet if commanded to do so. But as with any legendary weapon, it needs an equally legendary source of power. In this case, that would be the box art legendaries of these games, Xerneas in X, Yveltal in Y, the Pokemon gods of life and death. One will be inside the base, restrained by Team Flare, ready to provide power to the ultimate weapon. That's what would happen, of course, if it didn't allow the player to capture it. After obtaining the legendary, Lysander shows up in a brand new outfit. Lysander is defeated once again, and all looks to be over. But then Lysander, seeing he has nothing left, makes a decision. Using what little power the weapon did have, he launches it into orbit, then back down onto Geosinge, completely obliterating the Team Flare base, himself, and all that were inside of it. Except you, and literally all of your friends that were standing right next to him. You're all completely unharmed somehow. With Team Flare a non-factor at this point, you're finally free to complete your Pokemon journey unhindered. The endgame routes are, as usual, really great. You fight all of your friends except your rival one last time on a bridge, and then there's nothing between you and Victory Road. And when it comes to the Victory Roads in Pokemon games, Kalos has a pretty nice one. It's not quite on Unova levels in either Black and White or the sequels, but I'd have to give it runner-up. The part where you reach the mountaintop and you're surrounded by what looks to be the ruins of a castle is just so cool. On top of that, you get to have one final battle with your rival here, and they basically tell you that I know you'll be the champion by the time we next meet, which has got to be one of the best rival moments in the series. It really feels like the best way to conclude your rivalry. After being bested by you over and over again, your rival accepts that there's just no stopping you. Whereas they seem to become frustrated and insecure about it before, here they just seem to be almost proud of it. Like, if anybody's gonna beat me 100 times, I'd want them to be the champion. As with all Pokemon games up to this point, the path to the champion is impeded by the Elite Four. In Kalos, the Elite Four consist of Mauville, Wickstrom, Seabold, and Drasna, whose teams consist of Fire, Steel, Water, and Dragon types respectively. Like last generation, all Elite Four members only have 4 Pokemon, which I'm definitely not a fan of. To me, the Elite Four are just as exciting and imposing as the champion, and for them to have 2 less Pokemon than the champion just doesn't make sense to me. I get that the champion naturally has to be the strongest, but the difficulty increase from having to fight 5 Pokemon versus having to fight 6 is enough. Why another Pokemon needed to be removed to bring them down to 4 is unknown to me. But regardless, even with the same amount of Pokemon as Generation 5's Elite Four, X and Y's doesn't really even come close to their difficulty. There are some questionable Pokemon choices on these teams. The real issue comes down to their move pools. The issue with type-themed Pokemon teams is that no matter how tough they are, if they can't cover their major weaknesses effectively, they're always going to end up getting swept by a fast Pokemon that has a type advantage. Malva's team, for example, has one move to cover water types, and that's Wild Charge on her Pyroar. There are 0 moves which cover Fire's other weaknesses to Rock and Ground. Looking at Seabold, he also suffers from a lack of coverage against electric types, other than Earthquake, which is Gyarados knows. But given how fast most electric types are, it's unlikely that Gyarados is going to be able to tank a Thunderbolt with its ×4 weakness. His Barbaracle could learn Dig or Bulldoze, 2 moves which would benefit it, but instead has Cross Chop. This dude is a rock type. What normal rock or ice type is scaring him? Is a fighting type move really the best option? That one's pretty minor though. What really makes these teams so ineffective comes down to 2 things. The near absence of any sort of status moves and the inability of these trainers to switch out their Pokemon. Those 2 factors make any Pokemon battle so much harder, especially switching out Pokemon. I don't know what the trainer AI level for X and Y's Elite Four is, but I can almost guarantee it's set to a lower setting than in past games, because these people just do not switch out their Pokemon for any reason. Neither does Diantha. Trainer AI level is one of the most important things to making a fight difficult. It's why Cynthia was so difficult. She was just smarter than any other trainer you had ever faced. Diantha could be given the same team as Cynthia and still be way easier just because she doesn't make full use of her team. Diantha has a Hawlucha, Tyrantrum, Auroras, Gourgeist, Goodra, and a Gardevoir who can Mega Evolve. There are some definite gems here. Obviously, Mega Gardevoir is a threat. Hawlucha is dangerous, Tyrantrum is dangerous, but Auroras and Gourgeist just left me wondering why. Gourgeist is providing absolutely nothing of value. 3 of its 4 moves are Ghost-type moves, one of which is Trick or Treat. The remaining move is Seed Bomb. Even if you somehow don't have a Pokemon that knows Crunch or Nightclaw, it's not scaring anybody. Auroras is literally just an Ice Rock type that has no speed. Nothing more needs to be said in that regard. Overall, as long as you can save a good Ghost type for the Mega Gardevoir, you're all set to become the next champion of the Kalos region. And obviously, that's what happens. Diantha is defeated and you are crowned champion of Kalos. You submit your team into the Hall of Fame and you've completed your journey. But given you, along with your group of friends, saved the entirety of life on Earth from Team Flare a few hours ago, a celebration is held in your honor, arranged by Professor Sycamore. Regarded as a hero, you're awarded with the Honor of Kalos, a medal depicting the Prism Tower superimposed onto a blue, white, and red background, which is literally just the French flag. But a familiar figure emerges from the crowd. AZ, the old king of Kalos from over 3,000 years ago. I haven't mentioned him directly up to this point, but he doesn't really affect the story up until this point except for like one moment in the Team Flare base. And if there's anything about X and Y's story that's worth saving for the very end, it's this. AZ was the creator and original user of the ultimate weapon. After a massive war involving people and Pokemon led to the death of his beloved Floette, AZ created the device in order to drain the life force of thousands of other Pokemon to revive his Floette, making both of them immortal in the process. His Floette is disgusted by his decision to kill all of those Pokemon just to revive it, and for 3,000 years AZ is left to wander the earth in search of his Floette, completely alone. AZ challenges you to a battle in order for you to show him what a real trainer is. His team isn't very good at this point in the game, after all you did just beat the champion. Upon defeat, he expresses his gratitude to the player for freeing him from his sorrow, and then immediately following this, a light shines down from the sky. AZ looks up, and it is none other than his Floette, who had watched him from above, waiting until AZ truly returned to the man he once was, before firing the ultimate weapon. This leads to, in my opinion, one of the most iconic lines in the Pokemon series, and an actual display of emotion in a Pokemon character unlike anything the series had ever shown us before. And with all of this, the journey of Pokemon X and Y comes to an end. Despite all of its shortcomings, what a way to kick off the new era of Pokemon it was. As I mentioned at the start of the video, this game will be turning a decade old this October, and while it's a bit too early to think about right now, I can't help but wonder what a remake of this would even look like. Of course, we aren't even ready for Black and White remakes yet, and we probably won't get those for another few years, but looking back at X and Y, this game deserved a second chance. The Generation 5 games did everything right the first time, but X and Y was trimmed down and compromised into becoming half of what it was supposed to be. Like, notice I haven't even said a word about Zygarde throughout all this, that's how irrelevant it became. Talking about X and Y's cut content and storyline could be an entire video of its own though, and I'm here to look at what these games are, rather than what they might have been. But now, it's time to move on to something far less unresolved. A remake of quite possibly the most universally beloved Pokemon games of all time. One that not only retained the spirit of the original, but expanded on the experience in a way that we haven't seen from a Pokemon remake since. Let's turn our sights to Hoenn in Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. I'm just going to preface this by making it known that Hoenn is my favorite Pokemon region. And I don't mean that to say that Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald or the remakes are my favorite Pokemon games. No, I mean literally the geographical region itself. Like, whoever designed the map for Ruby and Sapphire back in its development was deep in their bag. I think a lot of Pokemon games after Generations 3 and 4 have the issue of being too straightforward in their routes. Like, as someone who loves Generation 5, I will be the first to say that Univa's routes in general kinda suck. So many of them are just horizontal, occasionally vertical lines from one city to the next. And this trend carries on to X and Y and reaches its absolute worst in Sun and Moon. But in Hoenn, routes feel like they're meant to be explored. And part of this is due to Hoenn's much more rural geography. While man-made architecture and infrastructure thrives in regions like Kalos and Unova, nature rules Hoenn. It would only make sense then that so many of Hoenn's legendaries are representative of forces of the natural world. Much like the eternal conflict between Kyogre and Groudon, the region's cover legendary is representative of ocean and land, Hoenn itself is a conflict between water and ground. Hoenn is notorious for its abundance of routes that are comprised entirely of ocean. Some might say it's infamous for them. In Alola, a comparably water-surrounded region, players get from each island to the next via boat ride, which occurs over a quick cutscene. But Hoenn forces you to make that journey yourself. If you want to get to the Pokemon League so badly, then you have to face everything the island can throw at you, water routes included. Of course, by the time you even get to the water routes, you've already made it through forests, caverns, a field of volcanic ash, a desert, the inside of a volcano, etc. Hoenn, more than any other region, feels untamed by humans. Pokemon feel that much more threatening and powerful in Hoenn because they're built for the environments they are found in. You, a human, are not. This isn't to say that humans aren't advanced in Hoenn though. In fact, they're probably one of the most technologically advanced regions in the Pokemon world. They managed to build one of their largest cities in the crater of a meteor impact, in the middle of the ocean. And also, how many other regions have an active space program? Rather than Moss Deep, the center of Hoenn's scientific research, the player begins their journey in the much more humble Little Root Town. Home to the region's Pokemon Professor Birch, it isn't much to look at, but it does have one of the greatest hometown themes in the entire series. Shipped over in the back of a moving van, the player and their family originally came from the Johto region, but moved to Hoenn in order for their father Norman to take a job as a Pokemon gym leader in the nearby Petalburg city. What's strange about this is the fact that Professor Birch mentions that Norman and himself went to college together in their youth. So was Norman actually originally from Hoenn, or was Birch originally from Johto? A bit of a mystery there. But anyways, after arriving in Little Root and setting the time, the player introduces themselves to their rival, either May or Brendan, of course, depending on whichever character the player didn't pick in the intro sequence at the back of the van. May and Brendan's personalities do differ slightly, but both are generally upbeat, very friendly, adventurous, and competitive. If you are one of the surprisingly large demographic of Pokemon fans that seemingly despise friendly rivals, you will be sorely disappointed in Hoenn. Both this rival and your secondary rival Wally, which will be introduced soon, are extremely kind people who are always glad to see you succeed. But back to Mayor Brendan, they also happen to be the professor's kid, and will frantically run out of their room after introducing themselves, saying that they need to go help their father with field research. This leads to the player following them outside town and being met with one of the greatest and most effective ways of introducing the starter Pokemon in the series. Birch is being attacked by a wild Poochyena, much more threatening than the Zigzagoon of the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. He frantically informs you that inside his bag there are 3 Pokemon and that you have to choose one in order to save him. This, unlike most Pokemon games, is not the choice of a partner or a friend. This is the choice of a weapon, a defender. Of course, it will later become a close companion, but in that moment the player knows that whichever one they pick will be their ace throughout the entire game. But the protagonist has no idea. Fortunately for the protagonist and the player, you really can't go wrong in Hoenn. Treecko, Torchic, and Mudkip are, in my opinion at least, the greatest starter Pokemon trio in the series. Not just in design, but in capability too. But speaking to the designs of these 3, they're all amazing, but the Mudkip line in particular really stands out to me, especially Swampert. It's one of the only 7 Final Evolution starter Pokemon that aren't bipedal, and because of this, it has this kind of animal fierceness that many other starters lose in favor of human-like qualities. As for which one you should pick in terms of being the most effective for the region, it's still probably Mudkip. Marshtomp and Swampert's water-ground typing is an amazing one, with the only thing you really have to fear being grass types, which already are an offensively weak typing anyways. The Mudkip line has an advantage over 4 of the 8 gyms, with water being super effective against rock, fire, and rock again for Tate and Liza, and ground being immune to Watson's electric types. With all of that being said, however, I usually go for Treecko, just because he looks really cool and drain moves are just so awesome when it comes to potionless Nuzlocke. So after saving the professor's life, he awards you with a Pokédex, tells you to keep the Pokemon you chose to defend him with, and you're on your way in the Hoenn region. After a quick trip down routes 101 and 102, and a battle with your rival somewhere in between, you reach the workplace of your father in Petalburg City. He's settled in as a gym leader remarkably quickly, but informs you that you aren't anywhere near strong enough to challenge him yet. And really, are you ever strong enough for Norman? It's always one of those gyms that I dread the most. But anyways, we don't have to worry about that for a while. Right now, it's time to take a look at one of the greatest characters in the Pokemon franchise, Wally. Wally walks into the gym as you're talking to your father and asks him for a Pokemon. I guess as a gym leader that's part of his responsibilities. Whether it's in his job description or not, he's a kind man, so he allows Wally to borrow Zigzagoon and instructs you to accompany him in his attempt to catch his first Pokemon. Wally is of course successful, and has the kind of luck Nuzlockers could only hope to achieve. Seriously, how lucky is it that on the very first time he'd ever even tried to catch a Pokemon, it ends up being a Ralts? This also makes Wally one of the few main rivals whose main Pokemon is anything other than a starter. Another thing that makes Wally so unique is what he has to overcome to be a strong trainer. He suffers from some kind of unspecified illness that affects his breathing. Due to this, he is planning to move to live with his aunt and uncle in Verdanturf, where the air is apparently very clean. What I don't get about this is how the air in a town near the sea, where he already lives, could be significantly worse in terms of quality than the air at the base of a literal volcano. Literally the next route over is covered in a carpet of ash. So, long story short, Wally is awesome, and he always has been. But I am talking about Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire here, so what exactly is different about these games from their originals, other than a graphical upgrade? Other notable changes include mechanical improvements, like the addition of a day-night cycle, which leads to moments like this, where you can see the stars reflected in the puddles on Route 120. It's always been strange to me that the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald didn't have a day-night cycle. It's not as if the Game Boy Advance wasn't capable of it. The Game Boy Color was able to do it in the previous generation with Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Either way, it's here now, and it's much appreciated. Some modernizations are less objectively positive, such as TM moves being reusable and of course the new EXP Share. But as for why reusable TMs could possibly be taken as a negative, well, it really just comes down to preference. I, for one, enjoy the added strategy that comes with being able to use a TM on a Pokemon only once, especially when it comes to Nuzlocke, where that Pokemon could be lost forever if you aren't careful. It's like making an investment into that Pokemon's future and just contributes to the overall value that each Pokemon in a Nuzlocke has. There's the addition of Generation 6's worldwide network of online play, which is obviously a complete positive. Here's one that's often overlooked: the physical special split. This is the one that I honestly forget about so often to the point that it actively harms me whenever I play pre-Gen 4. Basically, if you aren't aware, back in the first 3 generations of Pokemon, physical and special move categories were determined based on a move's type. Meaning that all normal, fighting, flying, poison, ground, rock, bug, ghost, and steel type moves dealt physical damage, and all fire, water, grass, electric, psychic, ice, dragon, and dark type moves dealt special damage. This led to some really awkward situations where a Pokemon like, for example, Mightyena, who has a far better physical attack than special, is forced to use special moves if it wants stab bonuses from its own dark typing. Mightyena is one of the best examples of this, but there were several more Pokemon which were negatively affected, before it was alleviated in Generation 4 by placing each new and pre-existing move into either the physical or special category, with its typing having no influence in this decision. And of course, the mechanical change with the most gameplay impact has to be Mega Evolution. Much like in X and Y, the ability to Mega Evolve your Pokemon at basically any point throughout the game once you receive the Mega Ring is poorly balanced, and leads to fights which were once tough and exciting and intense to being just another team getting swept by a Mega. I do, however, appreciate the fact that the player isn't given this ability until after the 5th gym, as opposed to in X and Y where you get a Keystone which is required to initiate Mega Evolution right after the 3rd gym. So at least the first half of the game remains sacred. To add insult to injury to Pokemon difficulty purists such as myself though, the player, much like in X and Y, is immediately given a powerful Pokemon completely for free, which can also immediately Mega Evolve. I would actually argue that in this case it's worse, because that Pokemon which you are just handed for free is a Latios in Omega Ruby or a Latias in Alpha Sapphire. Legendaries shouldn't even have Megas to begin with, but I just can't stress enough how ridiculous it is to just give the player a Pokemon like that. There have been times in previous games where the player has had a Legendary available to them before the 6th gym, such as in Red, Blue, and Yellow where you can use Surf to access Zapdos as soon as you beat the 5th gym. Or how you could technically catch one of the legendary dogs before the 4th gym. But both of these require extreme preparation, and everything would have to go right for you to be able to obtain these Pokemon that early. And if you did catch one, it gave the accomplishment so much more significance. Honestly, talking about how hard the value of legendary Pokemon has fallen off is its own subject entirely. There is one upside, however, that comes from being given Latios or Latias, and that's through the brand new Soaring feature. As an alternative but not a replacement for the Fly HM, upon capturing or defeating Groudon or Kyogre, Steven gives you the Eon Flute. It allows you to summon whichever legendary dragon you received earlier in the game to take to the skies over Hoenn. From here, you actually get to control your flight, and choose exactly where on the island that you want to land. There's even the chance of encountering mirage spots, which can be explored to find not only rare Pokemon and items, but some specific islands will occupy mysterious floating rings containing portals to what seems to be some kind of pocket dimension. If interacted with, these rings will initiate a battle with one of several legendary Pokemon available in these remakes. The names of these mirages and their available legendaries are as follows: Crescent Isle, home to Cresselia; Fabled Cave, home to Reshiram in Omega Ruby and Zekrom in Alpha Sapphire; Gnarled Den, which only appears if the player has both of the aforementioned Unova dragons in their party, home to Kyurem; Nameless Cavern, home to Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, with each having a different time of day that they will appear; Pathless Plain, which requires 3 Pokemon with maxed out EVs to be present in your party, home to Cobalion on Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, Terrakion on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and Virizion on Mondays and Thursdays; Trackless Forest, requiring either Lugia or Ho-Oh in the party, home to Suicune, Entei, and Raikou, each appearing during a different 20-minute interval throughout the hour; this giant space-time rift, home to either Dialga in Omega Ruby or Palkia in Alpha Sapphire, requiring all 3 of the late guardians in your party, or if Dialga and Palkia are in the party, Giratina will appear; and finally, this Storm Vortex, home to Tornadus in Omega Ruby and Thundurus in Alpha Sapphire, if a cast form is in the party, and Landorus if the aforementioned Unova legendaries are both in the party. I remember just how much fun it was to research all of these requisites for finding these legendaries, and then actually going out and searching for them, or just getting lucky and seeing a Mirage Island I hadn't visited before. I did a lot of hating on Latios and Latias earlier, and I don't want anyone to take it that I just dislike the fact that these Pokemon exist in the game, or even the fact that they're obtainable so early. It's just that I think the Mirage spots prove that getting any good Pokemon is so much cooler when you have to work for it. Also, I forgot to mention that the rings on the islands themselves were placed there by Hoopa, a mythical Pokemon that sort of acts as a trickster god, in an effort to spread chaos by putting almost every legendary in one place. That also means that the legendaries that I mentioned that didn't show up through one of these rings just came to Hoenn because they felt like it, I guess. Some areas have been completely revamped in the remakes, the most notable being Mauville City. In the original games, Mauville was a pretty standard town that just happened to be the home of Electric-type Gym Leader. But in the remakes, Mauville is a city that defines itself on its artificiality, basically looking more like a shopping mall than a city. This change to Mauville is honestly one of my favorite things about these remakes. Similar to what I said about Lumiose at the very beginning of the video, something about how Mauville is designed makes it seem even larger than it actually is, even though it's already the new largest city in all of Hoenn. There's a lot to do here, like restaurants, shops, and battle facilities. It also says right above an abandoned mining project, which sought to expand the city even further by expanding deep underground. This project was eventually cancelled before it got very far, and its remains stand as a constant reminder to humanity that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Another abandoned human creation lies in Hoenn's southern seas, and also just so happens to be a product of further Mauville engineering projects. Titled the Sea Mauville, this vessel was led and funded by Watson for the purpose of an underwater mining expedition. It seems that Watson and the city of Mauville once again overestimated their funding though, and the ship's service was soon discontinued around the same time as the shutdown of the new Mauville project. The ship was simply abandoned as it was, and began to partially submerge over time, with there being plans for its demolition. But upon seeing the ecosystem which the half-sunken ship sustained, its demolition was cancelled, and there it remains to this day. The Sea Mauville replaces the location called the Abandoned Ship, which existed back in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. It can be assumed that these two are basically the same location, but given the original RSE and the Gen 6 remakes exist in 2 entirely different timelines, it could very well be something different. But when it comes to human interference with the natural world, Mauville gets beat by the 2 villain teams of Hoenn, Team Magma and Team Aqua. Ruby and Sapphire were the first and to this day only Pokemon games to feature a different evil team based on which version you had. Emerald sort of combined the roles that both teams took in their respective versions into one story, with the added bonus of making interaction between the two opposing groups very frequent. However, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are decidedly remakes of the original two versions only, so any Emerald content isn't present. Regardless, the two teams aren't without their changes, with quite possibly the biggest being in regards to their designs, specifically their leaders Maxie and Archie. They received a massive style upgrade through these remakes, especially Archie. The giant golden anchor necklace is such an insane look that Archie somehow manages to make look cool. Giving Maxie glasses is also a really nice touch. Looking at his old design, the glasses fit him so well that I forgot that they weren't always there to begin with. As for their admins, well, they're just straight up completely different people. Courtney, Tabitha, Shelly, and Matt all look way different from their original designs, and I think this works really well for them in terms of differentiating them from the regular grunt look. Not just that, but the motivations of the two groups have changed significantly in the remakes. They still believe that their respective geographic element is superior to the other. Magma wants to expand the land, Aqua wants to cover it in ocean. In the remakes though, their motivations are expanded on significantly. Team Aqua wants the world to be covered in water in order to restore it to a primal state, one in which Pokemon thrived in the seas and humans did not exist. They are completely aware this time that their actions would result in the deaths of not only themselves but also of all other humans, whereas in the original games they didn't seem to think that far ahead. Despite everything they do being motivated by their desire to make a perfect world for Pokemon, I guess they just chose to ignore the fact that the majority of Pokemon in the world don't live in the ocean, so their fate would be the same as the humans. Team Magma, however, is very honest in their human-centric goals. They wish to expand solid ground, therefore giving humans more room to grow. Both of the team's plans are referred to as Project AZOTH. As for what AZOTH stands for, it's never specified, although a grunt mentions that the A and Z are meant to signify beginning and end. AZOTH is also an actual word, used historically as a term for mercury, which was believed in alchemical studies to be the base of all metals and a universal solvent. Guess it only makes sense then that this plan would refer to both teams' desires to restore the world to a primal state. They can't do it alone, and as with every evil team, they need the power of a legendary Pokemon to accomplish their goals. Fortunately for both teams, the respective legendaries that they desire to control don't seem to be very intelligent. In fact, out of all the covered legendaries, Groudon and Kyogre seem to be the most animalistic out of all of them. The other legendaries display some kind of higher knowledge like Dialga or Palkia, or the ability to understand and connect with humans like Zekrom or Reshiram. But Hoenn's legends have neither of these qualities, which is something I really like about them. They're just these forces of nature that are as old as the land and sea itself, and while they can be manipulated through the red and blue orbs, as both teams find out, they can never truly be controlled. In fact, immediately upon releasing them from their slumber, it's pretty obvious that either Maxie or Archie, whichever game version you're playing, is way out of their respective league. So much so that they quickly decide that it's best for the sake of everyone that they finally make peace with the leader of the opposing team, who is present during the awakening of the legendary Pokemon. This, of course, means that they'll send the child into the Cave of Origin to defeat or capture the ancient deity. On top of all that, Groudon and Kyogre will both tap into an ancient power within the Cave of Origin to undergo primal reversion, a state which transforms both into the ancient original versions of themselves, restoring what power was lost to them over the ages. Of course, you could just throw the Master Ball you received early in the game, but you should probably save it for later if you can help it. Either way, canonically, you are successful. The crisis is averted, and unlike Pokemon Emerald, the fight between Groudon and Kyogre never occurs, and Rayquaza never has to get involved. At least, for now. Which, while accurate to the original Ruby and Sapphire for the most part, is kind of disappointing too. The scene of Rayquaza parting the heavens to stop the conflict between its fellow natural deities is one of the most iconic, if not literally the most iconic scene of a legendary Pokemon in the history of the games, and would have been phenomenal to see in 3D, especially given how well everything else was translated into the third dimension in these remakes. Overall though, you can't be too mad given what I'm talking about soon, and I'm sure you all know at this point what that's going to be, but for now let's move on to the Elite Four and Champion. Here in Hoenn, you have to fight the Elite Four in order, which I really prefer over being able to pick and choose each member you want to fight. It feels more like you're getting one step closer to the champion in each battle, and it allows for better balancing as the levels increase for each consecutive fight. This Elite Four group begins with Sydney. Take a look at him, and no, he is not a fire type trainer, he is a dark type. Speaking of the dark type, remember the physical special split I talked about from earlier? It definitely helps him out a lot here, and it makes him one of the few battles that actually got more difficult in these remakes. Now, his dark types, like his Mighty Anna, can actually be used to their full potential because they have access to physical dark moves. Of course, a Mighty Anna is still a Mighty Anna, and even at its full potential still isn't that great. His whole team really isn't going to be much of an issue with a fairy or a fighting type. That's what makes these Elite Four teams so difficult to evaluate. One of these Pokemon on a team with type variety could be good, but here they're just probably getting swept. If you don't, however, have an easy answer to the dark type, then I could definitely see that Absol being a big problem. And Cacturne could be a pest too with Leech Seed and Payback. Next up is Phoebe. She's actually not a water type trainer, but ghost, and while a dark type should do the trick for the most part, she does have some moves which could interrupt a clean sweep. Confuse Ray is always the most annoying move ever, and Will-O-Wisp, Toxic, and Curse will chip away at HP in a hurry if you can't feint her Pokemon in time. Sadly, Sableye, unlike in Generation 3, now has a weakness, and that's to the Fairy type. But a Fake Out followed by a Shadow Claw or a Foul Play will still hit hard. After her is Glacia. She specializes in the Ice type, but given the limited number of those introduced in Hoenn, her team is very repetitive. Sort of surprisingly though, she manages to put together a very tough fight. Her two Frostlass eliminate the potential of a fighting sweep, the Glalie are tough to take out, and her tank of a Walrein is a threat to rock and fire types with its partial water. Overall, there aren't really any clear answers for her, and couple that with the constant hail, the near constant blizzard threat, and most terrifying factor of all, sheer cold, a move that despite its 30% accuracy will always instantly KO when landed. Yeah, this fight is actually pretty tough. Good job Glacia for proving ice types can be great. Lastly is Drake. He's a dragon type trainer, so if you have an ice type, you're at a great advantage. But as mentioned just a moment ago, those aren't very common in Hoenn, so chances are that you don't. Unfortunately for Drake though, Generation 6 changes things. Now the brand new fairy type has shown up and has made him much less scary. Still though, fairies aren't very common throughout Hoenn, and the chances that you don't have a fairy type or an ice type are so high that he still remains highly intimidating. Flygon is a really good Pokemon, and having two of them can be really good. Kingdra is weak only to the uncommon fairy type, as well as having a really dangerous moveset with Dragon Pulse, Surf, Ice Beam, and Yawn. Finally, both Altaria and Salamence are going to be very tough without an ice or fairy type, and you're just going to have to brute force your way through this battle if you want to make it to the champion. Assuming you do regardless, Steven Stone will be waiting for you at the throne. Connecting to his love of geology, his team consists of rock, ground, and steel types, and wow, what a team it is. Skarmory, Claydol, Aggron, Cradily, Armaldo, and his infamous Metagross, rivaling only Cynthia's Garchomp in terms of fear factor. To make matters worse, now his Metagross can Mega Evolve, so he basically forces your hand from the very beginning to save a Mega of your own that can stand up to it. However, despite the massive buff of Mega Evolution, his Metagross isn't quite as invincible as it was in Generation 3. Back in those days, for whatever reason, Steel resisted both Dark and Ghost attacks, meaning that two of the Psychic type's most prominent weaknesses were nullified by the Steel typing. As of Generation 6, this is no longer the case, as Steel was rebalanced to account for its new strength against fairies. Metagross aside though, look at his Skarmory. It knows spikes. How many battles in Pokemon games actually have you going against entry hazards, let alone the champion? Steven is a great example of how a Pokemon team can be themed around a certain concept, in this case geology, without becoming a one-type team. So what makes Steven so good, while Diantha is so bad? They both have a good Mega, Diantha is way higher level, and Diantha's team even has more type variety. It really just comes down to the fact that most of her team is so frail that even if they have great offensive potential, they likely will be fainted before they even achieve it. Steven's Pokemon also just have much better movesets that play to their strengths. Taking a look at one of Diantha's Pokemon, her ORAS, it has Blizzard, Thunder, Reflect, and Light Screen. First of all, Reflect and Light Screen on a Pokemon that is going to get one shot by any fighting type move regardless is kind of ridiculous. It would be less ridiculous if she actually knew how to switch out her Pokemon, but she doesn't. Also, Thunder and Blizzard are both 70 accuracy moves. Having both of those moves on one Pokemon is bad enough, but when they're your only source of offense on a Pokemon, it's basically a wasted party slot. But at least Steven Sohn is awesome, and despite all that has changed over the course of the 12 or so years since his origins, he remains a great fight. During this section, there are a lot of points where I have to refer to either Courtney or Matt, Magma or Aqua, etc., so I'm just going to pick Magma here and refer to everything involving either of the villain teams that way throughout. So if I say Courtney or Magma, just know if it's Alpha Sapphire, it would be Matt or Aqua. Okay, for some reason I had this weird Mandela effect where I kinda thought for the longest time that the Delta episode was some kind of DLC. Like, I distinctly remember that when I first played the game, I either had to search for it on the eShop or download it as an update. But as it turns out, it was always just a part of the original game. All that really matters though is that it gave Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire one of, if not the greatest post-game campaign in the franchise. The Delta episode begins with a scene inside the Moss Deep Space Center, where the researchers report that a meteor has suddenly changed its entire trajectory, and is now on course directly to Earth, with one scientist noting, it's almost as if it's alive. The post-game plot stars an original character to these remakes, Zinnia, who actually had been following your adventure throughout the story, but was disguised as a Magma Grunt in Omega Ruby and an Aqua Grunt in Alpha Sapphire. After the player defeats Steven, she drops her act and straight up breaks into Professor Birch's house and steals Brendan or May's Mega Evolution Keystone. Zinnia isn't the only party out on the hunt for Keystones though, as Courtney literally shows up at Wally's house and starts interrogating him for any information regarding his Keystone's whereabouts. The player shows up right in time to stop this, but Wally couldn't have handed it over even if he wanted to, as his was stolen from his house too. Maybe this is a sign that people in the Pokemon world should start locking their doors? But why is Zinnia going around and stealing all these Keystones? And why, despite the fall of her team, is Courtney still going around and causing trouble? In uniform, might I add. Well, it turns out that Courtney was a little too invested in Project AZOTH to just let it go after the near disaster caused by Groudon or Kyogre. She still hopes to accomplish AZOTH's end goal, although through different means this time. Immediately following this battle with Courtney, Steven calls the player and requests that they meet him in Rustboro at his father's company immediately. Once there, Steven's father will inform both of you of the meteor which is set to soon collide with Earth, and the efforts of Devincorp and Mossdeep to prevent it from doing so using rockets to deter its path. In order to accomplish this, however, a meteorite shard from Granite Cave is required. Upon arriving there, Zinnia and her Whismur named Aster will be found examining the cave art, depicting an ancient legendary Pokemon. Zinnia will confront you and demand to battle you. Her team consists of an Altaria, a Tyrantrum, and a Salamence, all dragon types. Upon her defeat, she sincerely congratulates you, and gives you the meteorite shard as a reward. She then proceeds to drop the hardest bar in Pokemon history as she leaves, saying, "Hey, the actions that you're taking now, are they based on the ideals that you cling to? Or are they based on actual truths? And if they are, how much of the truth do you think you know?" Yo, whoever was at the writing or translating department and decided to just throw in such an amazing line out of nowhere deserves a raise. After her exit, Steven will once again call you to inform you that time is running out, and that you must meet him again at Moss Deep Space Center as soon as you can. There, Steven and Professor Cosmo will be waiting, and the plan to avert the threat to Earth is explained. The meteorite shards are needed to power a device that, in theory, could warp the meteor to another world, which would ensure that it could never harm Earth. The technology to do this already exists on a fundamental level, commonly seen through warp panels in Pokemon gyms. The full plan is to harness the extreme amounts of energy released at the moment of Mega Evolution to open a warp hole in the path of the meteor. But it turns out that one meteorite shard isn't enough, and another purer sample from meteor falls must be acquired. Before you and Steven can leave, Zinnia enters the lab, very much uninvited, and remarks on what the culmination of 3,000 years of technology has led up to, most likely referring to the Kalos superweapon which led to the possibility of Mega Evolution. She seems very disapproving of using Mega Evolution as energy to create a warp hull, but to be fair, what other choice does humanity have? She clearly doesn't have any better ideas herself, or at least doesn't share them. She leaves just as casually as she enters, and Steven remarks on her familiarity before the two of you embark to Meteor Falls. Here, Steven finds the meteorite shard, and introduces you to a woman who he met. The woman is part of an ancient tribe called the Draconids, a group that has worshipped the legendary dragon Rayquaza for thousands of years. The tribe dates back to the times of constant conflict between Primal Groudon and Kyogre, and it was through the Draconids that Rayquaza was first summoned to cease the fighting between the two. After doing that, they constructed the Sky Pillar in order to summon Rayquaza in times of future need, and predicted the current meteor threat thousands of years before it would occur. It's here that it's revealed that Zinnia is a member of this tribe, not just any member, but a lorekeeper, one which is burdened with the knowledge of the impending doom, and she has dedicated much of her life to attempting to stop it. Steven announces that he is returning to Rustboro, and upon following him there and attempting to enter Devoncorp, you'll literally run into a scientist who is fleeing Team Magma pursuers. You'll quickly dispatch them as you always have, and you'll learn that the evil team hasn't dissolved after all, with those that chose to stay with the cause serving directly under Courtney. The scientist informs you that Courtney stole the Dimensional Shifter, an activation device for the link cable system. That is not the literal Game Boy link cable, but the code name for the plan to warp the meteor into another world. Back at Moss Deep, Magma grunts have already swarmed the premises of the Space Center, and Courtney will be there waiting. She reveals that her plan is to utilize a life energy, the same energy emitted by Mega Evolution, which is contained within the rocket that is intended to intercept the meteor, to cause an explosion so much greater than the original Ultimate Weapon activation 3,000 years ago, to the degree of annihilating all life on Earth. This is a pretty good indicator that Courtney has lost her mind at this point, and holds a hatred towards the player for bringing an end to her leader's goals. Even though both leaders, upon seeing just how dangerous Kyogre and Groudon are at their maximum power, backed out of the idea far before the player put an end to the legendary's rampage. Also, I guess she's just too insane to realize it at this point, but the world is going to end regardless if that rocket doesn't get to space. So her using that life energy within to maybe destroy the world is just a guarantee that the world is destroyed anyways. Then again, maybe that's her intent. Steven recognizes how ridiculous of a thought process this is, and together the two of you fight the admin and a grunt and emerge victorious. Before you can rid her of the Dimensional Shifter, Aster rushes in and snatches the device away. Zinnia follows in and takes the device in her hand and explains why she disagreed with the whole rocket wormhole plan from earlier. She explains that if the meteor is warped away to some other reality, they could very well be dooming another version of Hoenn, and therefore the rest of this alternate Pokemon world, to the same destruction by meteor that the Hoenn we exist in faces. She even goes as far as to reference the pre-remake version of Hoenn directly, referring to it as a world where maybe the evolution of Pokemon took a slightly different path, where Mega Evolution is unknown, a world where that war 3,000 years ago never happened. This dialogue right here just might be the single most important lore development the Pokemon series has ever seen. This basically acknowledges that not only are parallel universes real in the Pokemon canon, but that the series has actually taken us down two different timelines set in two different parallel universes. One where the ultimate weapon was created and activated, thus leading to Mega Evolution, and the other where it was not. Following this speech, she crushes the activation device in her hand, which is definitely cool, but I for one just can't believe that the plan used to launch a rocket that will save the entire world is entirely contingent on one little handheld activation device. Like, judging by the reaction of the scientists basically saying, "Are you an idiot? You've killed us all," I can only assume that that little button was the only thing that they had which activated the link cable, which is kind of comical. Regardless, it doesn't matter, because Zinnia has a plan of her own. She promptly snatches Courtney's keystone away from her, delivering what seems to be a swift backhand in the process, and she promptly exits to the Team Magma base in search of the final keystone she needs. As everyone else is left scratching their heads, you follow Zinnia, and battle your way to Maxie, who is the holder of the fourth and final keystone that Zinnia needs. She once again just straight up mugs him for it, as his right-hand man just kinda stands there and watches it happen. She announces that she'll be heading to the Sky Pillar, and asks for you to follow. Maxie, who as it turns out couldn't wield the power of Mega Evolution anymore regardless, gives you his camera update, and you're on your way. Before you can enter the pillar though, you run into Wallace in Sutopolis, and he just casually lore drops that AZ actually visited Hoenn sometime throughout his life, and planted a tree in the city. When you find the whereabouts of the ancient tower, Wallace will be waiting at the entrance, and refuses to let you pass until you defeat him in battle. So if for some reason you preferred Wallace as a champion over Steven, and you really wanted to get that fight in the remakes, here you go. His team in this fight is the exact same as his champion lineup, except for them all being one level lower. But it doesn't quite have the same impact as him as a champion, because by this point you've likely leveled up at least 5 times between your battle with Steven and now, meaning you likely outlevel his team by quite a bit. Still, it's super cool that they included that fight, even if I kinda wish that they had buffed him a bit more to fit the point you're at level-wise at this point. After defeating him, he will indeed allow your passage, and Zinnia will be waiting for you at the base of the tower. As you ascend, Zinnia explains the multitude of ancient draconic art pieces inscribed onto the walls, depicting ancient historical events, such as the creation of the Sutopolis crater and the original interference of Rayquaza between Groudon and Kyogre. Eventually, through these drawings, the truth becomes clear. She intends to summon Rayquaza to destroy the meteor and save Earth. At the top of the pillar, Zinnia reveals to you just how alone being the lorekeeper really made her, as she was the only one who could bear the burden of knowing when and how the world would end if she didn't stop it. Here, she also refers to someone close to her who was named Aster. And no, it's not her Whismur, but someone who clearly came before it, and assumedly died some time ago. As for who Aster is, the only clue we've really ever gotten is from Shigeru Omori, a designer for several Pokemon games who said in a 2015 interview with the magazine Nintendo Dream that Aster was a lorekeeper who came before Zinnia, who also had some kind of special powers. It's really just kind of randomly revealed there that Aster was someone else besides the Whismur that was very important to Zinnia, and that's really all we get to know, unfortunately. After hearing this, the player promptly falls asleep standing up, and wakes up the next day with Zinnia standing in the exact same spot. Yeah, that part caught me off guard. Brennan or May must have been really tired, I guess. Anyways, Zinnia wastes no time as soon as you wake up, and begins performing a summoning ritual for Rayquaza. And it wastes no time showing up. Zinnia celebrates her success and informs Rayquaza of her wishes. She wants Rayquaza to Mega Evolve and destroy the meteor heading to Earth. But her 4 Mega Keystones do not react, and it's not as if Rayquaza doesn't want to evolve, but it just can't. The meteorites inside its body which allow it to Mega Evolve have lost their energy over the millennia. But as Zinnia seems to have lost all hope, creating one of the greatest reaction images in Pokemon history, a bright glow emerges from inside the player's bag. The piece of meteorite that you got from Mount Chimney way back in the early game is reacting to Rayquaza's presence. So naturally, the only logical thing to do is to toss it into the dragon's mouth, restoring its mega powers. But first you must capture the Rayquaza, which is actually a lot easier than you would think. Even though it's likely close to 10 levels higher than the rest of your team, given it wants to save the world just as much as you do, its willingness to join you gives it a much higher catch rate. And if you still have that Master Ball from way earlier, it's a good idea to keep hanging on to it for just a bit longer. Now, with Rayquaza by your side, and having been taught an ancient draconic move called Dragon Ascent, it's finally time to rid the Earth of the threat to its existence. And oh wait, nope, Zinnia is battling us. Here marks the appearance of one of the greatest Pokemon battle themes of all time, to one of the most disappointing battles ever. She has 5 Pokemon, all of which are Dragon types, all of which therefore are weak to Dragon Pulse. Coupled with the fact that Mega Rayquaza is a whole 10 levels higher than anyone on Zinnia's team and way faster, it's really just not even close unless you mess up pretty badly. I guess it could be argued that it was never intended to be anything more than an exhibition match for your new Rayquaza, and Zinnia probably wasn't fighting for anything other than being able to say she fought against Mega Rayquaza in a battle. I'm sure her Pokemon appreciated that very much. So after her swift defeat, Zinnia hypes you up one last time, and you don your general purpose hostile environment suit from earlier, mount Rayquaza, and prepare to launch yourself at Mach 5 towards an oncoming meteor. The scene of Rayquaza Mega Evolving as it leaves the stratosphere is actually really cool, and the music is fittingly epic. Rayquaza locates the meteor, locks on, and becomes a missile, smashing a hole straight through it. The meteor shatters into not 8 million pieces, more like 9 actually, but either way, those pieces were slowed down enough to the point where they're nowhere near as big of an issue. The crisis is averted, Zinnia's plan is successful, and the Earth is saved. But something isn't right. There's something unnatural about one of the meteor shards, almost artificial. The camera zooms in on what looks to be a perfect stark black triangle. Suddenly, the triangle moves, darting from one corner of your screen to the other, then back again, and then it stops. The triangle begins to glow red. Writhing tentacles emerge from behind it, at first silhouettes, but then proving to be of distinct orange and blue coloration. The triangle shatters. This is, without a doubt, the most hype moment in Pokemon history. The callback to the original Deoxys capture event, which was a limited time Nintendo event, is superbly executed with a triangle. Except this time it's even more cool, because A, you're in space, B, you're fighting it with its only natural enemy, Rayquaza, and C, it's level 80. If you made the mistake of using that Master Ball on Kyogre or Rayquaza, or Thundurus for some reason like I did when I first played, you're in for a battle here. The Rayquaza that you just obtained, the one that's 10 levels higher than the rest of your team, is 10 levels below Deoxys. The battle theme for this thing is also just amazing. This is how a fight against a legendary Pokemon should feel. Of course, no legendary Pokemon fight will ever truly match this one. If you weren't a fan of the Delta episode up to this point, this will make you one. It's just such a perfect way to top it all off, and I can only imagine how hyped someone who experienced the original Deoxys event was if they experienced this without prior knowledge. Game Freak also did a pretty great job of keeping it a secret too, as far as I remember. I don't really remember much Deoxys themed promotion, which must have been tough to do given how cool this thing is. Even in Pokemon Adventures is awesome, its fight against Mewtwo has got to be one of the best matchups in Pokemon history. So, should you manage to capture it, Deoxys is now yours. And the best part is, nobody seems to know. It can be assumed that Deoxys was the reason the meteor took such a sudden shift in direction to lead itself to Earth, but nobody really came to the conclusion that there was something inside the meteor. Speaking of that though, why did Deoxys want to hurtle itself toward Earth so badly? Did it just want to destroy it? There are a few evil Pokemon out there, but that would definitely make Deoxys one of them. Maybe it really just wanted to get to Earth for some reason, and decided that a meteor was the fastest means of doing that, not realizing the devastating damage that it would cause. However, given it is just a mutated space virus, I'd say the most logical explanation is that it didn't really have conscious reasoning because, well, it isn't conscious. It could have just been acting on a machine-like desire to spread itself to other planets, and Earth may have just been its closest logical target. And so with that, the Delta episode begins to conclude. Upon your return to the Sky Pillar, Zinnia has departed, leaving her Whismur to deliver you a note announcing her leaving. I do hope that she plans to come back for Aster though, because it's just kinda up there alone now at the top of the tower. Back in Moss Deep, the scientists celebrate, and what struck me as interesting here is the fact that they might not have even informed the public yet that there was a threat to the planet to begin with. It's not really like they had much time to though either, since I'm assuming the meteor just took a 90-degree turn and started speeding straight toward Earth. Back in the Magma lair, Courtney apologizes to Maxie for her overzealousness in following him, and Maxie too apologizes to her for leading her down such a dark path. This is why I can definitively say that while they are pretty messed up for pursuing a plan that would cause billions of people and Pokemon to die, the leaders of Team Magma and Aqua are at least redeemable. They take responsibility for their actions, and really as soon as the threat of people or Pokemon dying presented itself, they regretted everything and backed out of their plans immediately. We get a scene of Steven and Wallace conversing with each other, where Steven thanks Wallace for his help at the Sky Pillar and announces that he plans to eventually depart on a journey of self-discovery of sorts, in order to put into practice everything that he taught the player. I swear, every time these two characters get to interact with each other directly is just the coolest thing in the world, and I can't even say for sure why. Zinnia returns to Meteor Falls, where we see that the Draconid woman who Steven spoke to earlier was indeed Zinnia's grandmother. Here, she tells Zinnia to at last lay down her burden as lorekeeper, as she has done her duty and saved the world in the process. Finally, after a brief montage of reuniting with your rival, you return to Littleroot. it's night and you too can finally rest. See you tomorrow, your rival says. You both go home, and your journey comes to an end. Well, that's Gen 6. Was it perfect? No, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't hit slightly differently than all the other generations. Most of the problems I have with these two games come from their own ambition, which is undeniably a way better problem to have than the opposite issue, which Pokemon has had a trend of having in today's time, which is the tendency to underachieve. It's sad in a way, looking back on X and Y specifically, because there's just so much more that Kalos could have been. I remember back in those days, we didn't even consider the possibility of Pokemon Z just never coming out. I remember still thinking it was inevitable during Pokemon Go's first year of life, but then Sun and Moon came out and it just never happened. Generation 7 is its own beast entirely though. So, all in all, that's that. I have no idea how long this video is going to end up being, but considering it's my second ever video on YouTube, if you have stuck around this far in the video, I just want to say thank you. The amount of genuine support I got from my first upload, which was quite a bit ago by this point, was enough proof I needed that I can make a video like this one. And once this is done with, I really would want to start uploading more frequently and more consistently. Honestly, most of the time between my first upload and now has just been spent kind of just finding what I wanted to talk about. And that's not to say that I didn't have enough that I wanted to talk about, it was more so I had so much that I had to narrow it down. And I don't really know how many YouTubers decide to upload a 1 hour long plus retrospective on 2 different games for their second ever video, but I guess I'm one of them, and I don't know if it's a good idea, but I know that I had a lot of fun with it. And like I said at the very beginning, given the 10th anniversary coming up, I knew I wanted to do something like this within the span of this year, so it's better now than never. So once again, thank you for all the support on the last video. Thanks for watching, and I guess it's time to get to editing.